Hi everyone, okay, here's another great game from Bobby Fischer, played at the Vinkovci tournament in Croatia in 1968. His opponent here was Emil Nikolic, who there was no information about on Wikipedia, but we can assume he was a strong enough player if he was playing against Bobby in a tournament game. So, Nikolic had the white pieces and he opened with c4, which is the English opening and in particular the Great Snake variation after Bobby's reply g6, which is very flexible. It could go into the King's Indian or Grunfeld defense amongst other things, and it doesn't commit any central pawns, so in a sense he's keeping his cards to his chest, which is always a good tactic in the opening. And then came some normal developing moves with knight c3, bishop g7, g3 and e5. One drawback of the English opening is that it doesn't stake the strongest possible claim to the centre, and as White's still neglecting to do that, with his last move e5, Bobby stakes the claim himself. So bishop g2, d6, e3, knight f6, knight g, e2, castles, castles, and c6, which is the last book move. And at this stage White has the smallest of advantages, about a fifth of a pawn according to Fritz. Both sides have developed normally and neither have notable weaknesses. Bobby's last move is threatening to create a strong pawn center by playing d5, so Nikolic took action to stop that and played d4. But now Black takes the initiative and White loses his theoretical advantage for nothing. Rook e8, rook b1, e4, which is a pawn that's going to be a real nuisance for White, especially considering his light square bishop is fiend shadowed. It's got very little scope on g2. And b4 from Nikolic, who decided to aim for a queenside expansion as the center is becoming closed and he can't develop on the king side without creating weaknesses or losing tempi. Bishop f5, and now the position is completely equal, and this is a nice move that prevents an immediate f3 from White in order to challenge the pawn at e4 and give his bishop on g2 more scope. And instead of bishop f5 here, Fritz gave the alternative d5, and after c takes d5, c takes d5, knight f4. But this favors Black, only very slightly, but the one drawback is that the backward pawn here on d5 is fairly weak, and so maybe that's why Bobby didn't want to go in for it. So bishop f5 anyway. And then came h3, which is stopping any of Black's pieces coming to g4, but also creating a target at h3 that Bobby was quick to put the crosshairs on. h5 was what he played first, which both prevents g4 from White to try and make h3 less of a target, and also make space for the knight at h3, which prevents g4 from White, which would lessen the target here on h3, and also make space for the knight on b8 to come galloping over to the king side, as you'll see in a minute. So knight f4, knight bd7, a4, which is planning the move b5 and hoping for a queenside breakthrough. Knight f8, c5 and d5, locking the central pawns. And now the game has a King's Indian pawn structure, and it's logical for White to attack on the queen side while Black does the same on the king side. And that's how the game continued, with b5 from Nikolic, which is attacking the pawn chain at the base, as recommended by Aaron Nimzovich in his classic chess manual, My System. Knight h, a7, bishop d2, knight g5, rook b2, which is preparing to double rooks on the b file, but this proves to be a costly mistake later. And queen d7, and now the pressure is growing on h3 with all of these pieces both attacking and defending it. Nikolic didn't want to push it forwards because it weakens g4 too badly, so he played king h2. Then came bishop h6, a5, and bishop g4, a sacrifice that Fritz didn't like, but Bobby was much stronger than Fritz, so I think we can trust his judgment more. The idea behind it is to crack open a route to the white king, and in particular create a deadly thorn pawn. So after h takes g4, h takes g4, the opening of the h file here favors black, especially considering the lack of communication between white's rooks, and that's another reason for the bishop sacrifice. So rook h1 and knight f3 check, which forces bishop takes f3 as the only move, other than taking with the queen, which obviously isn't an option. And after g takes f3, the deadly thorn pawn has been created here on f3. And Bobby was an expert in the King's Indian defense, which often features attacks very similar to this one, and so it's not surprising to see him sacrifice a piece in order to get a similar style attack going. So then came king g1, bishop takes f4, and e takes f4, which is forced. If instead g takes f4, then it's mate in 3 with queen g4 check, king f1, queen g2 check, king e1, and queen takes h1 is mate. So e takes f4, king g7, and black is 2 points down in material, but with this move that difference drops to about half a pawn because of the threats down the h file. As well as these rooks ganging up against the king, there's also the queen threatening to come to h3 once one pair of rooks are traded off, and it would just be absolutely devastating for white. And Nikolic certainly chose the wrong time to blunder. Here he played f5, which was presumably trying to decrease the mobility of the black queen, but the game is essentially lost here anyway. Another line goes b takes c6, and after b takes c6, queen f1, which looks solid enough, but in fact it's easily winning for black. After rook h8, rook takes h8, rook takes h8, and here white is completely helpless against the threats down the h file. There's no way for him to prevent black's queen coming to g4 and combining with the rook to give mate on the h file. What's more, white is basically in zugzwang. He has no decent moves and can bring no further pieces to defend. If he tries to make space for his king to escape, he'll be mated. For example, if queen d1, then rook h1 check, king takes h1, queen h3 check, king g1, and queen g2 is mate. So Nikolic understandably wanted to avoid this situation, but the line he chose also fails, and there's no line that saves the game, all thanks to Bobby's earlier bishop sacrifice. So back to the game anyway. f5 is what Nikolic has just played. Then comes rook h8 with the same threats that we've just seen. And in desperation here, Nikolic offered back some material to try and save the position with bishop to h6 check. And after rook takes h6, rook takes h6, king takes h6, Bobby has regained his material with interest and a winning position. Nikolic gets a check here with queen d2, but it comes to nothing after g5. Then came b takes c6, queen takes f5, and now there's nothing white can do to save the game. Nikolic tried knight d1, but now it's a force mate in 5 moves. An alternative try at defending was queen e1, but then would come queen h3, queen f1, queen h5, and there's no way for white to stop black from bringing his knight to g4 with dire consequences. A sample continuation goes c takes b7, knight g4, queen g2 is the only move to avoid being mated, f takes g2, king takes g2, again is forced to stop the mate, queen h2 check, king f1, queen h1 check, king e2, queen f3 check, king d2, queen d3 check, king c1, queen takes c3, etc., with no hope for white in the least. So the game continuation anyway was king g6, sorry, after queen h3. Knight e1 is the last move from Nikolic, and then queen h3, and it's all over, mate in 4 now. So knight e3 was played, which is hoping to defend g2 with the knight, but now comes king g6, and Nikolic resigned because rook h8 is coming, and he's completely hopeless against all the threats. The line that Fritz gives as best play is queen t1, rook h8, queen takes f3. I mean, it's crazy, but see, it stays off the mate for the longest amount of time. C takes b7 and queen h1 is mate. So that's it, another great game from Bobby Fischer. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.